I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. It's now the day after Jody Wilson-Raybould addressed the House's Justice Committee. She was able to speak openly about 4 months of events. She testified that Prime Minister Trudeau and his office applied sustained pressure to intervene in the case of SNC-Lavalin. And when she refused, Wilson-Raybould believes that's why she was shuffled from Attorney General to Veterans Affairs. Our panel of MPs is here to talk about that. Welcome to Nation, and I'm joined by Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations, Mark Miller, Conservative MP and Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Cathy McLeod, welcome, and NDP MP for Northern Manitoba, Nikki Ashton. Welcome to Nation. Mr. Miller, I'm going to start with you. Did you believe Ms. Wilson-Raybould's testimony yesterday?
Look, this is an important occasion for the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General to provide her perspective to the committee and to Canadians. It's a perspective that the Prime Minister disagrees with. That said, as we parse through the testimony, it is clear that at no times was anything illegal committed, and both versions of events confirm that, and they also confirm that this was a decision-making that was solely in the purview of the Attorney General and hers to make alone.
But do you personally believe her?
My view in this is immaterial. I believe that the Prime Minister acted as he should have, and vigorous conversations should have happened between the Prime Minister and the Attorney General. And I believe that at all times the Attorney General acted within the sphere of what she was instructed to do, which is to be the Attorney General of Canada, and that she was not directed by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has the national interest at heart, and the absence of these vigorous conversations would concern me more.
Ms. McLeod, your reaction to what you've just heard, which is pretty much what the Prime Minister said yesterday.
Anyone reading the testimony from yesterday, from a former Crown prosecutor, a trained lawyer, someone that took copious notes, someone who was under oath, who clearly articulated all the events, there is without question in my mind, as she indicated, she was subjected to severe and ongoing pressure. And so I think, that's number one. Concerning is the Prime Minister likes to say it was about jobs, but much of her testimony indicated it was more about the Liberal electoral interests. And I would disagree that there isn't some potential criminal charges. I'm not saying it is a criminal offense, but certainly our leader today suggested there's 2 areas in the criminal code that might have been broken, and he's asking the RCMP to investigate.
Ms. Ashton, I guess your reaction to Ms. Wilson-Raybould's testimony yesterday?
Well, I was shocked by her testimony. Many of us were, and I admire her tremendously. Partisanship aside, this is a strong woman, a strong Indigenous woman, a trailblazer, who yesterday spoke her truth, and she did talk about how her identity as an Indigenous woman, the big house she belongs to, the fact that she comes from a long lineage of matriarchs, put her in a place to do that. I know there's much admiration from her, from communities in our north, from across the country. She spoke truth to power. And what's deeply disturbing is the Prime Minister's response to all of this, right from the beginning, his treatment of her. I mean, this is a Prime Minister who talked about a new day, reconciliation, nation to nation, to great fanfare announced that she would be the Attorney General. And yet, when she stood her ground repeatedly, she was punished for it. And, yesterday, I think we just heard the first part of all of this, and certainly, I stand with many that want to hear more from her, and want to see that that there is justice for her, and that we hold Prime Minister Trudeau to account, who clearly was working in cahoots and in favor of rich corporate friends at SNC-Lavalin.
Mr. Miller.
Yeah.
Mr. Miller, of course, you're Parliamentary Secretary of Crown Indigenous Relations. No other department probably embodies this idea of reconciliation and nation-to-nation building. But how can we move forward on these when the PM has kind of tarnished the star of the person who most embodied this? How can you move forward?
Well, reconciliation is bigger than any one person, and that includes the Prime Minister. It includes the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General. It is a path for all Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And if you look at some of the progress that's been made with this government, it is something we need to be very proud of, and recognizing that there's a lot to be done and a lot to be moved forward on. I take, for example, the Child and Family Services legislation that was tabled this morning. We talk about self-determination. We talk about a very important core element, which is control over the culture and identity of your own children. When we get criticized for consultations, let's look at what those consultations yielded. A third of those tables said the #1 issue was Child and Family Services and control over Indigenous children. That is something that all representative groups, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations, applauded this morning. I'm not going to say that what's going on at the Justice Committee is a distraction, because it is something that the committee takes quite seriously. But let's focus on what the job of the government has been and what it has achieved. And there's some very, very important gains that will outlast this government and subsequent governments. So no question that mistakes can be made, and reconciliation will be messy. But I think there is a number of people saying, for someone to say in such a cavalier fashion that reconciliation is off the road because of the actions of one or two people, I think it's highly spurious.
Ms. Ashton, you of course represent a riding made up of largely Indigenous people. How confident are people leaders that, especially in your riding, that this nation-to-nation relationship can move forward when somebody like Jody Wilson-Raybould seems to be tarnished a bit?
Oh, it comes up in almost every conversation in the last few weeks that I've had. It really, people, where I'm from, in our north, saw that this was a gesture from the government to do things differently. And obviously many of the folks that I represent did vote for the NDP, and yet, for them, Jody Wilson-Raybould was a symbol, a leader that they respected and respect tremendously. Many of the people that I represent also had great hope that what Prime Minister Trudeau was saying was going to happen. And I have to say a lot of that hope has been dashed because of a series of I guess, inactions or missteps. But this one's a real blow. And I mean, to say that it's just a couple people, things aren't off the rails, well, I think this is a hard reality for Liberals to grapple with. And I would suggest that they talk to folks on the ground. I mean, we've heard leaders from BC be extremely vocal. Former Grand Chief, actually, from our area, Sheila North's been out in the media. Jody Wilson-Raybould is speaking truth to power, like so many Indigenous people and Indigenous women do. And, like so many Indigenous people, so many women, she was told repeatedly by powerful people, powerful men, to get in line. And she refused. She stood by her ethics. And so many people on the ground are standing with her. And like I said, this is something that I don't see how the Prime Minister can repair the damage of. But certainly a lot of people on the ground are highly cynical of his commitments to reconciliation and nation-to-nation based on this and other things as well.
Ms. MacLeod, can the Conservatives move forward on these principles? We're talking about reconciliation, nation-to-nation, when there's still that deep distrust out there of what happened under the Stephen Harper government.
So first of all, I do want to go back to talk about what happened and some of the details that are woven into the story. What we have learned in the last few days is the former Attorney General, asked for a meeting to talk about some serious concerns with where they were going with the rights and recognition framework. She arrives at that meeting, there's the clerk and the Prime Minister, and they really went after her in terms of SNC-Lavalin. So she asked for a meeting related to the rights and recognition framework, and her testimony says yesterday we eventually got there. So for a Prime Minister who claims that there's no more relationship more important, it was clearly not a priority for him in terms of that particular meeting. It was more in terms of protecting his corporate friends and his electoral prospects. This was in September. So it's a bit into the weeds, but it really, to me, was so telling in terms of some of those dynamics that are going on. And then really what we ultimately are seeing is, yes, rights and recognition framework, we now hear they actually decided to walk away with it way back in September of October last year.
But can Indigenous people look to the Conservative Party as an alternative, though?
Certainly there's many things that I think we did that were good things in terms of moving forward. Matrimonial real property rights. I just at committee this morning, I talked some things that might not sit well with everyone sit really well with people in communities, like financial transparency. I had an email, every week I get emails from people saying, please, will you do something to help me about this? So, I think, our record was not perfect, and I think we recognize that we need to do a better job. We need to have a better conversation, and I think we have a new leader, and he's clearly put that as a priority, and he's put that as a priority for me to ensure a much better relation.
Well, we certainly have more to talk about on this issue, but that'll have to wait until after our next break. Welcome back. We continue the discussion with our MPs. Now, you think there was nothing else happening in Ottawa other than Jody Wilson-Raybould's testimony and the reaction to it. But there have been important things happening of interest to Indigenous peoples. And Ms. McLeod, I'm going to start with you. For example, both the Conservatives and NDP have had motions and emergency debates related to SNC-Lavalin, which has pushed aside other things, such as the third reading of Bill C-369, for example, which is the legislation that wants to make September 30th the National Indigenous Peoples Day. Arguably, partisan politics is getting in the way of government getting its business done, especially when it relates to Indigenous people. Would you agree or disagree?
Absolutely, I would disagree. For example, the Indigenous language, there was very little time spent at second reading. There's been huge effort at committee in terms of trying to get that moving forward. We supported the Indigenous language bill at second reading. At committee, we're hearing the concerns of the ITK. We're hearing concerns from, community groups, off reserve. And someone actually even brought up the media and that there was no recognition. I know APTN has done lots of work around language. And so, we're hearing about what could be potentially very serious gaps in what the government actually presented and how they went about doing the consultation. But, I think Parliament is always having to respond to issues of the day, and it doesn't matter which private member's bill is up. It's always, as I say, it's more about the issues of the day, and the Speaker thought that there was an important reason for an emergency debate, and of course, that's just how Parliament is sometimes.
Ms. Ashton, of course, you brought up in question period just yesterday about Mr. O'Regan couldn't meet chiefs about the treaty land entitlement. Your colleague brought up another question, Georgina Jollybois, about the ice roads, the condition of ice roads. However, is this getting any play, of course, because of this scandal?
Well, I think what's really concerning here is that for 3 years we've seen that the government hasn't actually moved on a number of key issues. The question I raised was around treaty land entitlement. Manitoba First Nations are taking the federal government to court because of their failure to act on the demands that are being made by First Nations around land acquisition. And it's pathetic. We shouldn't be at this place. First Nations should not have to be spending money on the courts, and if only the ministers would take some time to sit down and work with them to work through these problems, there would be a solution. So I don't think it's the issues around SNC-Lavalin. I think it's very important to get to the bottom of that, but really it's the government's, I would say, misplaced priorities and inaction on Indigenous issues. I will say that when it comes to Georgina Jollybois' work on a National Indigenous Day, we are confident that this will move forward. It has to move forward, but we're also concerned that senators appointed by the Liberals aren't seeing that the Romeo Saganash's bill on the UN Declaration is not of an utmost priority at this time. So I would shift the question around to say, is the government using the SNC-Lavalin scandal as a way of distracting us from the work that they're not doing? I don't think they're thinking of it that way, but the reality is that they're failing to move on a number of key priorities for First Nations, and everybody's noticing.
Mr. Miller, if you want to respond to what Ms. Ashton just said about the inability of the government to move forward.
Well, look, we've established from testimony to date that the integrity of the justice system was never compromised. In the face of that, we have a Conservative leader that's essentially calling for an election, and we know the strong winds from the right that are xenophobic and quite dangerous for our democracy are blowing quite hard. The Liberal Party is fighting against that, and we have the mandate of the government to push through until October. You do hear the truth to power mantra pushed around, but frankly, we should be speaking the truth all the time. And so, yes, there's some partisanship. Is there more work to be done? Absolutely. And if you look at the Child and Family Services legislation that was tabled today, and the corresponding press conference with AFN, Métis groups, and ITK, this is a momentous occasion for people that have seen their children taken from them over decades and decades, and it is a first step in getting this relationship right and ensuring that what we've heard at the negotiation tables from at least a third as their number one priority is getting properly responded to. So this is something we need to do before the next election, and we plan to do it, and with the support of the parties to my right, I hope that it will get done, as well as the Senate. Let me remind everyone about the appointment process of very, very bright people. They are not Liberal senators, they are independent senators, and they do push back at us, and they will have their word, but they are highly qualified people in their field, and to politicize them, I believe, is a shame.
Lastly, Mr. Miller, I do want to ask you, should Jody Wilson-Raybould resign from caucus? And should she run under the Liberal banner in October?
Again, my personal opinion in this doesn't matter. This is a caucus decision to be taken by caucus. The Prime Minister is reflecting on the testimony that was given. I do acknowledge at the end of the day that this is a team sport, so people need to assure that they still have confidence in the leader of this party. But again, this is something that needs to be discussed and properly ventilated in caucus. And in fact, we do have to listen to the different voices in caucus, that for, against, medium, or whatever you would hear in the panoply of views that you would get inside sometimes heated caucus debates. But that's not a decision that will be ventilated here. It needs to properly be done for the sake of our own, the way we run a Westminster-type system inside caucus.
Well, thank you. For the next 2 weeks, you get outside of the Ottawa bubble and get some perspective, I guess, on this. Again, thank you for talking to me.
Thank you.
After the break, Indigenous Services Minister Seamus O'Regan and a long-awaited announcement on child welfare reform, but has it been overshadowed, of course, by recent events. Please stay with us. Welcome back. The big news for Indigenous people today was the long-awaited child welfare reform legislation. Bill C-92, as it's known, promises to affirm the inherent right to exercise jurisdiction over child and family services. But it needs to go through Parliament and get royal assent in a matter of weeks. And some provinces aren't in a hurry to hand over jurisdiction. For more, here's Nation to Nation producer Ken Jackson. He did this one-on-one with Indigenous Services Minister Seamus O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan, it's been about a month delay getting this bill tabled. What was the reason for the delay?
Substantive consultation. Substantive consultation and seeing it right to the end to make sure that we got it right. We had done extensive consultations, some 2,000 participants and 65 different consultations. Collectively, we represent thousands of people who are actively involved in this and who are directly affected by it. We had to get it right. This is what it looks like. This is, sometimes it's a bit messy when you see how the sausage is made in the sausage factory. So it doesn't move fast, but it was real. We really did want to do a substantive consultation on this. And so, it did mean it went to the last minute. Yes, it did. But, very happy, and I think the smiles up at that podium bear witness to that.
You had a lot of support in there from various Indigenous groups, but right after they saw the first draft of this bill, the next day they were against it. They said it didn't give automatic jurisdiction. There was issues there. How did you overcome those? Because you're still not giving automatic jurisdiction with this bill. You're asserting the rights there, but deals still have to be made. So how did you get past that?
Well, I'll give you the avenues. First of all, you're absolutely right. It was asked, does this give jurisdiction? And I barely had the words out of my mouth when leadership behind me shouted out the words no. This is an affirmation of responsibility. They always have responsibility. We're affirming it. What we're doing now is we're inviting people, we're inviting parties to get involved in coordination agreements. And at the end, those coordination agreements will take about a year. At the end of it, we're hoping that an agreement will be reached, and that will affirm paramountcy. And if an agreement is not reached after reasonable efforts, paramountcy still lives.
No, that's the thing. It says reasonable efforts are made to reach a deal within a year. If they're not made within a year and reasonable efforts were made, then the jurisdiction is enforced? Is that what's reasonable?
We'll see. I mean, and this is one of the things we were talking about, questions and answers. So many of the answers that any one of us would give you right now is we'll see. This is uncharted territory. This is what it is to have pioneering legislation. This is what it is to go through a pioneering consultative process. You don't always have the answers, but we do know that we're in this together. We all know the result that we want, and we trust each other's intentions and our ability to go forward.
But the background does say if reasonable efforts are made to reach a deal and one's not made within a year, then the jurisdiction supersedes provincial and federal law, essentially. So what determines reasonable is what I'm kind of trying to understand, based on your own background.
We'll see. But all parties want to reach an agreement. We all will make reasonable efforts. We know where paramountcy lies, and we've just lined out a process in which we can achieve it. So we'll see. But this is exciting. I mean, it's a bit, when you don't know the certainties and the definitives, it's kind of a bit scary. I'm embracing it because this is what it is. This is an indication of how pioneering this legislation is. This is an indication of how pioneering this consultative process has been.
Now, take us through the funding aspect of it. It's not detailed, and I believe you said it's basically a needs-based approach. Like, you come to it, like we work out a deal and we decide and we work out what is needed per deal. Is that how this is going to unfold?
Yeah, we're going to deal with people as locally as we can. We're going to deal with First Nations, Inuit, Métis on their terms. We believe in localizing these things as much as we possibly can. The more that you can make decision-making processes closest to the ground, the better. The more that you can retain families as a unit, the better. I mean, we're led by three guiding principles here. The first one is that the interests of the child are the most important. The second is, as we reiterated up there, the second is just the transmission and the continuation of customs, of language, of tradition, of practices is important to the well-being of a child, right? And then it's the continuation of care. It's making sure that, we're a child and family, where decisions are made medically about them, that their views are heard and that they're heard without discrimination. And those are our three guiding principles. And those principles anybody can adhere to right now who's involved with child and family services. Too much of the money that we put out with right now is going towards protective services, which really means apprehension of children. It's a very expensive prospect. We'd rather a lot less of that money go towards apprehending children and more towards preventative and prenatal care.
Last question. You said last minute. It really is right down to the wire. How do you get this through the House and to royal assent?
You begin by talking to the Senate right now to see if we can start doing pre-studies, to see if we can, get some of the work done concurrently as we bring it through the House. And begin by consulting with all members of the House, regardless of party lines, and to get their feedback. And to build up a coalition that will allow us to get it through the House quickly. And there's a great willingness, I believe, to do that. I really do believe that this is so important that it does cross party lines.
Well, we'll be keeping an eye on it. I appreciate your time.
I appreciate you keeping an eye on it.
All right, back to you, Todd.
Thanks, Ken. Next week, we'll put SNC-Lavalin behind us for a while and devote our entire show to child and family services and the possible impact of Bill C-92. If you missed any part of tonight's episode or a past episode, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.